Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going exploring, the world of gay urban spaces and communities.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at a 1994 academic book. It's called "The Margins of the City: Gay Men's Urban Lives," and it looks at how these communities kind of formed and flourished in different cities, but especially in Manchester in the UK.
It's sort of like urban regeneration, but from like a totally different perspective, like looking at how social and cultural forces impact the development of a city, not just the physical buildings and stuff.
Right. It's about more than just like the physical spaces. It's about identity and belonging. So the book starts off talking about this concept of gay space. I was wondering if you could maybe unpack that a little bit. Like, what does that actually mean in this context?
Yeah, so basically it refers to the actual physical places where gay people can be themselves openly. Like it's like a visible kind of manifestation of the gay community.
Okay.
So like think about it. It could be a single bar or a bunch of businesses, even a whole neighborhood.
Right. Right. But the book also makes it clear that gay community, that's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of term.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, it's so important to remember that there's incredible diversity within the LGBTQ plus community. We're talking about all sorts of subgroups, each with their own unique interests and identities, and also ways of, coming together. This specific book, it focuses mainly on the experiences of gay men, and it's really important to acknowledge that. Historically, lesbians are often organized differently, more through social networks and stuff, not so much focused on specific physical spaces.
That's really interesting. It speaks to like how different groups kind of navigate urban environments and shape them in different ways. Now, talking about specific locations, the book spends a lot of time on Manchester's gay village. What can you tell us about how this specific space came to be?
So, the gay village in Manchester, it's really a story of resilience. It shows how changing social attitudes, new laws, and even actions by the police all played a part in shaping this community. And before 1967, believe it or not, it was actually illegal to have a gay bar in the UK.
Wow, really?
Yeah. But in 1965, something happened that really drew attention to this issue.
Wait, so there were places that everyone knew were gay bars, but they were operating illegally. I mean, that sounds like super risky. What happened in 65?
So there was this pub in Manchester called the Union Pub, and it was known as a place where gay men gathered. And the licensee was actually imprisoned for outraging public decency.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the irony is this whole event, instead of silencing the community, it kind of made it stronger. The pub ended up being known as the New Union, and it became like this really important part of Manchester's gay history.
So almost like a rallying point, a symbol of defiance
Mhm.
against all that oppression.
Yeah, exactly. And then in 1967, the Sexual Offenses Act passed, and finally, it was legal to open gay bars.
Oh, wow, that's huge.
Right, big step forward. But that wasn't the end of the journey.
I bet. Social change, it rarely happens overnight.
You're telling me. So in the 1980s, police raids on gay clubs, especially the one on Napoleon's in 1984, became this big flashpoint. But instead of destroying the community, they actually made it stronger.
Oh, so these raids that were meant to intimidate, they actually backfired.
Totally. It put the whole issue front and center, and it actually strengthened the relationship between the gay community and the city council. The council recognized the injustice, and that whole period contributed to this idea of a designated gay village, a specific space, for visibility and acceptance.
Okay, so from illegal meeting places to a recognized village, that is quite a change. But the story doesn't end there, right? The book mentions how the demographics of the village changed over time. What were the implications of those changes?
Right. So initially it was a very working class crowd, very diverse. But as time went on, it's become more affluent and it attracts a younger demographic now. And this, it brings up all these questions about who feels welcome in the space and who's represented there as it changes. Will all segments of the gay community still feel like it's their place as this demographic shift happens?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important point. And it really speaks to those broader themes in the book, right? How these spaces reflect the constant kind of push and pull, the negotiation of identity within a larger society.
Exactly. It's about finding your place, but at the same time, navigating this constant social change. It's like this ebb and flow.
So we've got this picture of Manchester's gay village, but that's not the whole story, is it? The book talks about other cities too.
Right. It's like taking a world tour. But through the lens of, gay urban life, we get to see these communities and how they've taken root in different contexts, each one unique. Places like Toronto, New York City, even Newcastle upon Tyne. Each one gives us these valuable insights into how complex this whole thing is.
Okay, I'm ready for that world tour.
Yeah.
Let's start with Toronto. How does their experience compare to what we've seen in Manchester?
So in Toronto, the book highlights the role gay men played in gentrifying the Cabbagetown neighborhood. Essentially, they were key players in transforming this area. It led to a much more visible and accepted gay presence in the city.
Interesting. So taking this maybe neglected area and turning it into a vibrant hub of gay life. But wasn't the gentrification of Cabbagetown, even by a marginalized group, wasn't that also problematic in its own way?
That's a really good point, and the book acknowledges those potential downsides of gentrification, the displacement it can cause. Even when social changes are positive, they can have these complicated consequences.
Yeah, it's about striking that balance
Yeah.
between progress and making sure everyone benefits, right? So we had Toronto and gentrification. What about Newcastle upon Tyne? How does that city fit into all of this?
Newcastle, it's a very different story. It was a city that was already on the periphery, facing economic hardship and isolation. And within that context, the gay scene was much smaller, more marginalized.
So it's like double marginalization,
Right.
facing exclusion based on both sexuality and geography.
Yeah, exactly. And the book, it explores the challenges of creating community when you're dealing with all these layers of marginalization. It really underscores how there's no single gay experience. It's all shaped by geography, by the economy, by the social attitudes of a place.
It's about understanding that diversity of experiences,
Hmm.
recognizing that there isn't one narrative that fits everyone.
Okay, so we have Toronto and gentrification, Newcastle, and this double marginalization. What about New York? It's known for being this vibrant, diverse gay scene. How does the book approach New York City?
Well, instead of focusing on, the famous gay neighborhoods in Manhattan, it takes us to Jackson Heights in Queens. You might be surprised to hear about this thriving gay community that exists right in the middle of incredible ethnic and cultural diversity. It really challenges the idea that gay communities only exist in certain types of places.
Fascinating. It just shows how these communities can take root and flourish in unexpected places.
Yeah.
It just enriches the fabric of the city as a whole. But the book also talks about this tragic event that shook this community, right? You're thinking of the 1991 murder of Julio Rosera, a gay
Yes.
Latino man. This horrible act of violence, it really brought the Jackson Heights community into the spotlight. It forced people to have this conversation about safety and acceptance.
That's so heartbreaking. And it's a reminder that even in places that seem progressive, hate and prejudice still exist. It shows that the fight for equality, it's not over. There's still so much work to be done. But the book highlights how the community responded to this tragedy, right?
Oh, absolutely. They turned their grief and anger into action. And this event actually led to the formation of Queens Gays and Lesbians United, or QGLU. It's a really powerful example of how a community can organize and be resilient, even when faced with such awful things.
So from these tales of the cities, as the book calls them, we see this tapestry of different experiences: gentrification, marginalization, resilience, activism. And it's all intertwined with this constant pursuit of identity, belonging, and trying to find a place to call home.
Exactly. And the book does an amazing job of peeling back all the layers, revealing all the complexities of gay urban life.
But the book doesn't stop there. It goes even deeper, looking at the complexities of identity within the gay community itself. It has a whole section called Marginal Issues. Can you tell us a bit about what this section covers?
Yeah, so one chapter that I think is really important focuses on the experiences of bisexual individuals. It highlights these unique challenges that they face, often feeling caught between the straight and gay communities.
I immediately thought of that anecdote from the book about the conference on lesbian, gay, bisexual politics, and how the discussion about bisexuality was largely ignored.
Oh, yeah, that's a perfect example. It really shows how, even within movements that are supposed to be about inclusion, there can still be these blind spots. We need to constantly challenge our assumptions and make sure that everyone feels seen and heard,
Yeah.
even within our own communities, right?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, does that anecdote suggest there's a hierarchy even within the gay community itself?
It's a really good question, and it definitely makes us think about power dynamics and representation, even within groups that are already marginalized. And speaking of different ways of expressing identity, the book talks about the history of gay speak. What is that exactly? Gay speak. That's kind of a broad term for the unique language and slang that has come out of gay communities, especially in the past. One of the most fascinating examples is Polari.
Polari.
Yeah, it was this coded language used by gay men in the UK. It was almost like a secret language, used to communicate without being detected, back when society criminalized them.
Wow, secret language. That's so interesting. Why was there such a need for secrecy?
Well, you have to remember, we're talking about a time when homosexuality was illegal and people were really stigmatized for it.
Hmm.
So Polari gave gay men this way to connect and communicate without the risk of getting arrested or persecuted. It was about survival, finding community and safety in a world that was often hostile.
I can't even imagine trying to, like, order a drink in Polari. It must have been pretty incredible. So, what happened to Polari? Is it still used today?
Well, it started to fade away as the gay liberation movement gained momentum. And as society became more accepting, as that need for secrecy lessened, people just stopped using Polari as much.
Right.
But while it's fading, do you think maybe there's a bit of a loss of cultural heritage with its decline?
That's a good question. It makes you think about that balance between assimilation and preserving cultural identity. Polari is like this time capsule. It gives us this glimpse into the past and the lengths people had to go to just to connect and express themselves. But Polari wasn't the only way language was used to navigate identity. The book also discusses how the word queer was reclaimed.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge part of how gay language has evolved. It's about taking a word that was used to hurt people and turning it into a symbol of pride and defiance.
It's almost like, taking something that was used as a weapon and turning it into a shield.
That's a great way to put it.
So we've talked about bisexuality and gay speak. What other marginal issues does the book dive into?
Um, well, the book doesn't shy away from some of the more controversial aspects of gay life, like, for example, sadomasochism.
I can imagine that must have been a really sensitive subject, especially for a book that was published back in 1994.
You're right, and the book actually discusses the challenges of researching and representing SM in an academic way, especially during a time when it was really stigmatized.
It's like, pushing boundaries, challenging those conventions, and prompting these uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, totally. And some of the key insights from that chapter, I think, are that it's really important to understand the SM scene from an insider's perspective. You
Yeah.
can't just rely on those sensationalized media portrayals. And the book also looks at the ethics of researching and writing about sensitive topics like that.
Yeah, it sounds like a balancing act, right? Trying to shed light on this community that's often misunderstood, but at the same time trying to avoid further marginalization. The book even mentions how that media frenzy around those um, gay killer murders in London in the early 90s, how that impacted the perception of the SM scene.
Absolutely. The media loves to focus on the sensational details, and it often perpetuates stereotypes and fuels this fear.
It just shows how important it is to have these conversations responsibly, to avoid that sensationalism and really focus on understanding. So with these marginal issues, the book is really painting this nuanced and multifaceted picture of what it means to be part of the gay community. It
Hmm.
challenges that idea of a single monolithic gay experience.
I couldn't agree more. It's all about recognizing that diversity of experience, even within a community that shares this common identity. And it makes you think about how fluid these categories really are, how identities are always being negotiated and redefined.
Exactly. So we have Manchester's Gay Village,
Mhm.
stories from Toronto, New York, Newcastle, and then this deep dive into the complexities of identity within the gay community itself. It's like we're uncovering layer after layer, this really rich and dynamic tapestry of experience.
It's a journey, and that journey continues as we explore the next section of the book.
Well, let's not keep our listener waiting.
Hmm.
We'll continue this deep dive into the margins of the city right after this.
And it's amazing how the book handles this, delicate subject. It doesn't just throw facts at you. You get these glimpses into the lives of actual people in the SM scene.
Right.
It reminds us that there are real people behind these labels and practices.
But it's about humanizing a community that's often, demonized or stereotyped.
Exactly. The book even talks about that media frenzy surrounding those homophobic murders in London back in the early 90s, how the media just fixated on the victims' involvement in the SM scene.
Yeah.
Like their identities as gay men involved in SM became the story, overshadowing the violence they suffered. And that's why discussions like the ones in this book are so important, nuanced, responsible discussions. It's about actually listening to these communities instead of judging or making assumptions.
It seems like this book is trying to uh, strike a delicate balance. shedding light on this misunderstood community, but also trying to avoid further marginalization.
It's not easy, but I think the book does a pretty good job by emphasizing things like informed consent, safety, and doing research responsibly,
Right.
ethical considerations.
So we've talked about how the book handles these marginal issues, but zooming out a bit, we know it focuses a lot on Manchester's gay village, but it also takes us to these other cities. How does the book bring those stories together?
Well, after that deep dive into Manchester, there's a series of chapters called Tales of the Cities, and they look at, the development of gay communities in other places like Toronto, Newcastle upon Tyne, and New York City.
So it's almost like a comparative study, looking at how these communities evolved in these different settings.
Yeah, and it's not just about, finding similarities, but also highlighting those unique challenges and triumphs each city has.
We talked about Toronto earlier with the gentrification of Cabbagetown,
Yeah.
but what about Newcastle upon Tyne? What does that city's story add to the overall narrative?
Newcastle, well, it gives us a totally different perspective. Remember how we were talking about how the gay scene there was smaller and they faced much greater marginalization? It really shows how location and the economy can have a big impact on how these communities develop.
It seems like the book is saying that there's no single gay experience,
Right.
that it's really tied to the social and economic conditions and the geography of a place.
Exactly. And it's important to recognize those differences, to understand that spectrum of experiences within the LGBTQ plus community.
So Newcastle represents this more maybe hidden or overlooked side of things.
Yeah, it reminds us that even though there's been progress toward equality, there are still communities facing very specific struggles, within the larger LGBTQ plus movement.
Speaking of diverse experiences, we touched on New York City earlier.
Yeah.
What makes the book's exploration of New York so unique?
So instead of focusing on, Manhattan, which is often what people think of when they think about gay life in New York, the book takes us to Jackson Heights in Queens. And it reveals this thriving gay community that exists alongside this really amazing mix of cultures and ethnicities.
So it challenges our assumptions about where these communities might develop. It highlights that adaptability and resilience of the LGBTQ plus community.
Exactly. And the book doesn't shy away from the struggles this community faced either. Remember that tragic murder of Julio Rivera that we were talking about, the
Yeah.
activism that came after?
Right.
It's the stark reminder that the fight for equality isn't over. Visibility and representation are so crucial.
Absolutely.
And, the formation of Queens Gays and Lesbians United, or QGLU, after his murder is a perfect example of the power of community action in demanding, recognition and justice.
So we have these fascinating tales of the cities, each one offering this unique lens to look at the complexity of gay urban life. It's like the book is creating this mosaic piece by piece. What's next in our exploration of the margins of the city?
Well, it doesn't just end with these individual stories. It encourages us to step back and think about the bigger picture, What do these experiences mean for the future of these communities? And even the whole idea of what margins are.
I'm intrigued. What direction does it take?
It makes us think about how margins aren't just about physical spaces, but also about social and cultural boundaries.
So it's anyone who's outside the mainstream, anyone whose identity or experiences challenge the dominant narratives.
You got it. And the book emphasizes that these margins, they're constantly shifting, changing as society changes and as new challenges pop up.
Now, that's an interesting concept. This book was published in 1994, right?
Right.
How do you think the internet and social media have changed these margins since then?
It's a great question, and one that the book sort of touches on indirectly. I mean, think about it. We have online communities and virtual spaces now where people can connect and explore their identities in ways that weren't possible before. It's like a whole new frontier of social interaction and community building.
But I imagine this new frontier has its own challenges, too. We've seen how the internet can be used for bullying, harassment, creating those echo chambers that can reinforce harmful ideas.
Oh, absolutely. It's a double-edged sword. The internet can be amazing for connecting and empowering marginalized communities, but it also creates new risks and challenges. It's like the fight for inclusion and acceptance has moved to this whole new battleground.
So this idea of margins is even more relevant today than it was back in '94. It's not just about physical spaces anymore.
Right.
It's also about navigating these complex digital landscapes.
Exactly. And the book gives us this framework for understanding these dynamics, how they change. It encourages us to think critically about how power works, how identities are formed, how communities adapt and thrive as the world changes around them.
It's like the book has given us a set of tools to see the world differently
Right.
and understand these complexities of identity, community, and belonging.
And it challenges us to use those tools to build a more inclusive and equitable world, both online and offline.
This deep dive into the margins of the city has been so thought-provoking. It's given us this historical perspective on gay urban spaces, but it's also made us think about margins in a much broader way.
And that's the great thing about a book like this. It goes beyond its specific topic and offers these insights that are relevant to anyone who's ever felt like an outsider, anyone who's had to fight for their place in the world.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality has so many different sides, and it's always changing.
It definitely requires us to be vigilant and to have empathy and to always be willing to challenge the status quo.
Well, before we wrap things up, I want to leave our listener with one final thought. The book, The Margins of the City, was published back in 1994.
Before the internet as we know it, before social media changed everything.
Yeah. So how do you think these communities and spaces have adapted in this digital age? What new margins have emerged, and what challenges do they face today?
That's the question we all need to be thinking about as we try to create a more just and equitable world for everyone. And it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
I know.
That's how it is with these deep dives. Sometimes you end up with more questions than answers, but it's a good thing.
For sure. It's like we've got this roadmap now to understand how gay urban spaces have evolved, but the journey's not over, is it?
No, not at all. And the margins of the city gives us this framework, not just for the past, but for understanding where these communities are headed.
Okay, so let's bring it back to our listener for a minute. What are the big takeaways here? What's the lasting impact of this book, even though it came out way back in 1994?
Well, I think one of the most important things is just how diverse the experiences within the LGBTQ plus community are. You can't just talk about a single gay experience. It just doesn't exist. It shows us how things like where you live, economic conditions, social attitudes all shape those experiences. Like that saying, if you've met one gay person, you've met one gay person.
Yeah, exactly.
And the book takes that diversity even further by looking at those marginal issues we talked about: bisexuality, gay speak, even sadomasochism. It reminds us that even within a community that shares an identity, there are still these subgroups, these margins, each one navigating their own unique challenges.
It's about understanding those nuances and complexities
Yeah,
and not oversimplifying things.
absolutely. And another key takeaway, I think, is that this whole concept of margins, it's always changing. It's not fixed. What was considered a margin back in '94 might be totally different now.
Especially with the internet and social media. It's like those digital spaces have become these extensions of our physical world, new communities, new ways of connecting,
Right.
but also new challenges.
Exactly. The internet has created these amazing opportunities for people to be visible and connect in ways we couldn't have imagined a few decades ago. But at the same time, there's this new kind of marginalization, cyberbullying, harassment, and all that misinformation spreading around. It's like the fight for inclusion and acceptance has moved online.
Yeah, it's this constant tension between progress and pushback. It seems like every step forward is met with some kind of resistance.
That's so true. And it reminds us that we can never let up. Complacency can be just as dangerous as outright hostility.
So what can we do as individuals to help create a more inclusive and equitable world for LGBTQ plus people? What's our role in all this?
I think education is key. Learning about the history, the struggles, the victories, that's the first step to having empathy and understanding.
Reading books like The Margins of the City, having conversations like the one we're having now.
Exactly. It's about engaging with these topics, challenging our own biases, and being willing to listen and learn from people who have different experiences than our own.
And it's about using our voices too, speaking out against injustice and standing up for those who are marginalized.
Definitely. Whether it's supporting LGBTQ plus organizations, challenging discriminatory policies, or just creating welcoming and inclusive spaces in our own lives, every action, even the small ones, can make a difference.
So this deep dive into the margins of the city has been about more than just looking at the past. It's given us tools to build a better future.
A future where being on the margins doesn't mean exclusion, but rather a place of strength, resilience, and empowerment.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredible journey through the margins of the city.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued.